Welcome here to this task force meeting. We are here in the Austrian pavilion at the Dubai Expo. I have to tell you that Edmond Alfondary, founder and chairman of the task force, unfortunately cannot be with us for medical reasons, but he will follow us. He asked me to apologize and wishes us a very fruitful discussion. Edmond wants to share with you his emotion about the war in Ukraine. The task force, which is devoted to the fight against climate change, the main challenge for mankind, is heartfully with the Ukrainian people in this terrible and appalling development. Now, just some words on this Austrian pavilion. This is an example for a low energy building in hot climates, as it uses the chimney effect for cooling, which is a very old Arabic technology, and mixes it with modern Austrian technology. It's saving energy. You do not have a cooling system necessary because the chimney effect is cooling the room. Probably I can show it you a bit. We are sitting here in a big room, and you see the chimney going up, and the hot air is leaving the chimney, and cool air from the ground is coming in. In Austria, we are also market leaders in low energy buildings for cold climates, especially up in the Alps for alpine climates. We have some passive houses high up in the Alps, which do not have heating. So it saves a lot of energy, and even with no heating, it's comfortably warm. And this is a combination, not only we need energy efficient buildings for cold climates, but also energy efficient building for hot climates. Now I give the floor to our first speaker, Laurent Fabius, under whose able leadership the famous Paris climate agreements were negotiated.
Honorable colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to be with you to discuss carbon pricing. I want to insist first on its importance in our common fight against climate change, which, as we all know, is one of the major global challenges humanity is facing. Climate change is already a reality today. We can see its consequences in probably all parts of our planet. Last year, the whole world saw unprecedented wildfires, severe droughts, and record temperatures reaching more than 50 degrees in the UAE. We also saw catastrophic rainfall and flooding. The most vulnerable populations and territories are the first affected, torrents of mud and torrents of tears. This is a situation that we are all facing, not in 10 or 30 years, but now, as the IPCC chair recently said, the stakes have never been higher. The link between climate change and CO2 emissions due to human activities is more than established, and climate skepticism has receded. But climate fatalism is still present, even after COP26 in Glasgow. This 26 COP resulted in some advancement on several issues, with, for example, the Paris Agreement rulebook, the Global Methane Pledge, and the agreement on deforestation, but important targets have not yet been reached regarding, in particular, both NDCs and finance. These results call for more ambitious and more urgent actions. Our efforts should be focused not only on the long-term issues, which are important, but on the near future, and particularly on the following COPs, because climate action is a race against time. COP27 in Egypt will be important to enhance ambition, especially as Glasgow provides that parties must submit updated NDCs in 2022. Transparent and accurate reporting will matter. Financing goals must also be a central topic for this COP27. We should also keep in mind the horizon of the important COP28, precisely in the UAE. In these efforts, there are a few crucial tools which I believe can make a substantial difference. Carbon pricing is one of them. In spite of important developments of renewables, and in a context in which limiting emission is still often more expensive than emitting greenhouse gases, the right carbon pricing policies can further the goals I mentioned by encouraging climate ambition and generating revenues that can go towards financing, adaptation and mitigation. I will insist especially on three elements. First, social justice. In the last months, energy prices rose spectacularly in different parts of the world. The energy market is particularly volatile, and the effects are often felt in people's everyday lives. In Europe, carbon pricing mechanisms are sometimes blamed for this crisis, but this is wrong. In reality, these price surges are linked mainly to several factors on the demand and supply side, to the structure of energy markets, to the post-COVID economic recovery, and to the present geostrategic tensions. We should learn from this crisis. It is particularly important to pair carbon pricing policies with powerful social justice measures and transparent information about the use of money, because climate issues are always also social issues. Second, the question of ambition. Europe, in particular, is on the forefront of carbon pricing policies with the emissions trading system. The Fit for 55 package, which plans enhanced objectives, will be very important for Europe, but also for the world, in a context in which more and more economies are considering putting a price on carbon. Yet, disparities between markets are still high, and risk of carbon leakage exists. The European Commission has chosen the approach of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM. These developments will be crucial for the following years, and I personally believe ambitious action will be strengthened by international coordination. Third, cooperation. To be efficient, carbon pricing policies must be coherent across the world. Today, many CO2 emissions remain unpriced, and variations between each country's system tend to paralyze progress and discourage countries from acting. A joint effort, especially made by the main emitters and in the main sectors, is therefore necessary. The IMF's proposal for one or several carbon price floors focused on a few big emitters is particularly promising. The idea of lower price floors for developing economies is consistent with the important notion of common but differentiated responsibility that we call CBDR. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, the challenge we are facing is immense, and it requires deep transformations. These transformations can be helped by carbon pricing if we focus on social justice, ambition and cooperation. With this in mind, I wish all of you very fruitful debates. Thank you.
Uh, start the microphone again? Yes. After this very powerful message from Laurent Fabius, we are moving to session 1, carbon pricing, climate change, and the energy crisis, an economic analysis. And here our first panelist is Dominique Perrault, Deputy Director of the Economic Council for Sustainable Development, Ministry for Ecological Transition. Please, Dominique, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for the invitation. I am just going to share my screen. So thank you very much. I think that the global context has been already established perfectly by Laurent Fabius. So moreover, he has recalled that giving a price to carbon is a major device to decarbonize, according to standard economic analysis, because it tackles the problem at its source. Indeed, emissions are excessive because they are priceless. So I think it is unuseful that I repeat again the principle. Probably more important is to show how they work in practice and then to discuss questions about this approach. On the first point, I think, like Laurent Fabius, that the reference for 55 European package is a good starting point to illustrate that carbon pricing is not only a theoretical view. Indeed, despite Fit for 55 package uses a mix of regulatory instruments, subsidies, and effective pricing, as shown in this figure of this architecture. The latter, that's to say, carbon pricing, plays a very important role in the package. In this perspective, perhaps you have seen the statement of the European Association of Environmental and Resources Economists, who have emphasized that the setting of a price on carbon under the EU ETS remains a central element of Europe's climate policy, and they have supported its deepening and widening. Indeed, ETS prices in Europe are today within the range of the Stern and Stiglitz report as the level needed by 2030. And it has contributed to cost-effective reductions of emissions covered by this device, which have reached less 40% since 2005. So let's come now to 4 frequent questions about that. That's to say, peak oil, carbon price elasticities, distributive issues, and carbon pricing and climate cooperation. Of course, I shall provide only a few insights on each topic, but I think they will help for the further discussions. On the first question, in the context of the current energy crisis, is whether the market fossil price would not do the job, that's to say, to decarbonize economies. Indeed, we have to keep in mind that indeed fossil resources greatly exceed our remaining carbon budget. So that, of course, extraction costs are heterogeneous and so on. But indeed, my first comment is that short-term effects must not distract us from the need for carbon pricing policy in the long term, because we have two fossil resources available in soil. Second, the second frequent question concerns the effectiveness of carbon pricing on carbon emissions. On this point, differences between countries, between emissions of countries, and between their level of energy prices, or estimates of price elasticities of fossil products, provide a lot of evidence from the effectiveness of the approach. But I think that we can also underline that recent case control studies dealing more specifically with carbon prices are even more convincing. For example, you have on the left of the picture the result of the study of Kalel and the Shell-Pratt study of the impact of the EU ETS, which shows that plants submitted to the EU ETS have done very better than similar ones which were not submitted for different reasons. On the right side of the picture, you have also a study by Anderson about the impact of the Swedish carbon tax, which shows a similar discrepancy with comparable studies. And of course, I think that Laurent Fabius have mentioned the case of price floors, and we have a good experience in the UK with carbon price floor, and we have which shows it's a very shining example because it shows that this price floor has had a very important impact of the emissions of the UK by comparison with what we could say comparable countries. So I think that I can add now three comments about the other topics about distributive issues. It's clear that the way the distributional aspect of carbon pricing are perceived by the public opinion plays a key role for its social acceptability. Thus, in the European package, the Social Climate Fund outlines a framework to address these impacts, using, in particular, using auction revenues of the mechanism to solve the problems, to alleviate the problem. However, it must be noticed that regressive impacts of climate policy need to be addressed, whatever the instruments used. Indeed, if you take mandatory measures about electric cars, there are distributive impacts, for example. Also, it must be noticed that so far, the impact of carbon pricing has weighted little on the final prices compared to fluctuation in market prices of fossil products. So the problem in the present context, for example, in France, we have developed lump sum transfers to cope with the problem for very poor people. But perhaps we need to develop accompanying measures with ex-ante coverage instruments, which would be better than ex-post measures. My last comment will be related with carbon leakage debates, also evoked by Laurent Fabius, to recall that the first best to avoid the problems would be to foster climate cooperation. Indeed, cooperating for common carbon prices is not only effective, but would also eliminate the carbon leakage problem at the roots. And in this perspective, I will just finish by mentioning that this cooperation for common carbon prices could be based on the linkage of carbon markets. Moreover, ex-ante price differences should not be seen as an impossible hurdle, since initial allowances can be used to alleviate the problems and to create the conditions of mutually advantageous issues. And indeed, the potential gains are higher, the price are different in the ex-ante situation. So for all these reasons, I think that carbon pricing should remain the answer of climate policy, of effective climate policies, despite the actual energy crisis. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So thank you very much for this very good overview about the economics of carbon pricing. And we are now moving to our second panelist, Tom Hose, Head of Energy and Environment Division at the International Energy Agency in Paris. The floor is yours, Tom.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to you all in Dubai and China, and good morning to those of you in Europe. I hope my screen is shared. If so,
Yes.
then thank you. I'll follow up the excellent presentation of Monsieur Bureau, and give us a bit of the policy context and pick up some of the distributional consequences of carbon pricing. So to start off with, just a reminder that this is the ambition of where the world is. This is the IEA's version of how CO2 emissions have to diminish over the coming decades in all sectors of the economy. It's an economy-wide measure that has to be driven in transport with buildings such as the Austrian pavilion in Dubai, in the electricity sector and in industry. And to do all of that, we cannot rely on one single policy. So the IEA has been very clear that there are a multitude of different policies to tackle the different markets or quasi-markets in different parts of the economy. We need a regulatory approach in some instances where the market is not fully developed, or we can use carbon pricing. And we know as economists that this is the most cost-effective tool to deliver, where we can use the price signals of carbon pricing in a market where stakeholders and market players are responsive to market prices. So we've got to remember that carbon pricing is always one policy that has to work with the other regulatory measures in place around the economy. And I won't spend too much time on this. This is just a reminder of all the benefits that economists believe that carbon pricing bring to the efficient reduction of emissions in whatever sector. They can provide a short-term benefit. For instance, in the electricity sector, they can help with fuel switching away from coal or gas and moving towards renewables, so changing the marginal price in the electricity market. But they can also provide a longer-term incentive for the retirement of the more polluting plants, and even to change investment signals. So depending on where the carbon pricing is actually levied and in what particular sector, it can have a different effect, short-term or long-term, dealing with existing investment fleets, or in actually changing the direction of the investment in the future fleets. So for us economists, it's a very flexible tool that can have multiple benefits depending on at what point in the market or in the supply chain the price is actually levied. And this message has been picked up. To some people, carbon pricing seems a politically difficult tool to introduce and develop. But in fact, when you look around the world, there are a variety of different carbon pricing schemes, whether sometimes these are straightforward carbon taxes, or they are emissions trading schemes. And we see them in countries rich and poor, small, large, with huge populations. Last year, China introduced an emissions trading scheme, so it's become immediately the world's largest emissions trading scheme. But then there are other discussions ongoing about carbon tax reform in Brazil. Last week, even in South Africa, the South African government brought forward a new budget, which also had a carbon price in it and a planned ratcheting up. So carbon pricing is being implemented in a growing number of countries around the world. But we all face the issue of electricity prices, and this has been very much on the top of the agenda the last couple of months. These are just some snapshots of how prices are bouncing up, both in gas markets and in electricity markets. Firstly, in the wholesale level, but these are filtering through to see both impacts in retail markets, both for households, which is the middle graph in both columns, but also in the for industry, we see slight increases in the prices faced by industry. So this rise is an ongoing concern for all governments, and it's just a reminder that we, as Dr. Bureau said, we will need to address the distributional consequences in all of this. One way to do this, the first thing that the governments often flag up, is the fact that we have to remember that all of these measures are bringing forward new technologies, new industries, and the new jobs that come with that. So it's important to stress that in joining this fight in emissions reductions, we're actually creating new markets for new technologies, new goods, new services, which are wonderful opportunities and will literally create millions of jobs in the future. The other point to flag up is that we start off, in fact, all carbon pricing schemes start off with very low levels of carbon pricing. This is just to ensure the systems are working, that people get used to it, that we have the monitoring and reporting and verification measures in place to ensure these all happen. But we can start off with very low levels. But even at very low levels, we can end up with quite some significant revenues. And the revenues is another important aspect that Edmund in particular always likes to talk about. There are literally, in the world today, there's over $50 billion being raised in revenues through carbon taxation or through emissions trading schemes. And this is frequently used to directly support climate investments. But as you'll see, particularly on the tax side, it can also be used for direct compensation through providing compensation to vulnerable consumers or to industry which is exposed to international competition. So the role that the billions of revenues can play is an important point, an important political point in the discussion in the support of carbon pricing. Just to go back to a broader point, one of the things that the IEA has been stressing in the last years is that whatever instrument we introduce, whether it's a tax or a price or a regulation, it's very important that we do zoom in directly on the effect that any policy will have on people. And there's a number of different dimensions that one can address when looking at that, but all of these need to be picked up, reflected on, and incorporated in the policy decision making as we take forward the policy proposals. And this is also very important when it comes to implementing and exploring the impacts of carbon pricing. So that's a quick run through the emissions reductions that we need, the range of different policies that will be used inevitably to deliver on these emissions reductions, but the critical role that carbon pricing is increasingly having to play, and the role that revenues can play in supporting and addressing the distributional consequences of carbon pricing. I leave it just with a last recall that the IEA has a number of projects working around the world to encourage more countries to develop carbon pricing, and we carry on this work with all the partners who want to join us. Thank you very much indeed.
So thank you very much. We have now had our two panelists speaking, and now we have a discussion. If you want to raise your hand, please raise your hand so that we can give you the floor. Just one comment. In Austria, we just introduced in addition to the EU carbon pricing, a carbon pricing initiative, and our minister later on will explain how we are doing this in a socially compatible way by using the revenue from the carbon pricing to support people. So. No, not yet. So we can it fits in here well, so we can have this video message by Minister Gewessler. Yeah, because it fits very well to this socially competitive and socially supportive carbon pricing.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start by thanking you for the opportunity to contribute to your debate with this video message. Carbon pricing is an important policy instrument to internalize climate costs and to support decarbonization. An economic signal that allows long-term planning is key to drive the transition needed to tackle the climate crisis. That's why carbon pricing mechanisms, such as emission trading, need to establish a stable, and predictable price path to incentivize the investments in and the switch to green technology. At the moment, though, we are in a situation of high energy prices, who do not only pose a threat to industry, but can also aggravate energy poverty. We need to take quick action to counter the current energy crisis, and to actions should not come at the expense of climate policies and should not create additional counterproductive measures. Let me be very clear. The EU emissions trading system, the EU ETS, and I'm sure that this is true for other carbon pricing schemes as well, is not the cause of the rapid increase in energy prices in Europe. Our problem is the dependence on fossil fuel imports in geopolitically unstable situations. It is therefore important not to fuzz with the fundamentals of the trading system, as this would undermine the credibility of the market-based system. Our way forward to help stabilize energy prices lies in strong support for renewables and energy efficiency measures, thereby reducing import dependency. In the long term, a carbon pricing system reduces our dependency on fossil fuels, allowing us to make the shift to renewable energy sources, which are much cheaper and geopolitically much less delicate. European action on carbon pricing is important in view of creating a level playing field for industry. But the Austrian government is also intent on putting a price on carbon from all fossil fuel use. This includes transport, the building sector, small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as machinery use in agriculture. Consequently, we have decided to implement a national carbon pricing instrument, complementary to the EU ETS, which will take effect from July of this year. We will start with a moderate fixed price of 30 euros, rising stepwise to 55 euros in 2025. In response to the current energy price loops, we have also built in a moderate inflation correction mechanism, which will be effective only on a temporary basis. From 2026 onwards, we are planning to develop the system towards a full trading instrument, combined with an annual reduction factor compatible with our national goal of participants need a very clear economic signal that helps to gear investment into the right direction and to avoid lock-in effects to the long-term benefit of the planet and of society. We have foreseen financial compensation for private households in our scheme, even before the current energy crisis, compatibility of carbon pricing, despite the fact that the current price hike is not the result of carbon pricing. This compensation system not only ensures social compatibility, but also supports the general acceptance of the system, which is of course crucial. We will distribute this compensation to persons with a permanent residence in Austria as a lump sum payment in the form of a regionalized climate bonus. In 2022, the regionally differentiated climate bonus will consist of a basic amount of 100 euro for every person and a flexible regional component depending on the home of the municipality of up to 100 euro. This again relates to, among other things, the quality of the municipality's connection to public transport or the overall availability of infrastructure. So the harder it is to actually make the switch away from individual motorized transport, the higher the compensation. Therefore, a minimum of 100 euro and a maximum of 200 euro will be available for every person in Austria in 2022. This is a significant amount of money, particularly for families. Children under the age of 18 also receive 50% of the bonus. With these brief insights into our current thinking and our current doing on carbon pricing in the context of current energy prices, I would like to wish you all a very fruitful exchange and all the best from Vienna.
So thank you very much. And now we have Edmond connected to us. Edmond, if you want to say something, the floor is yours.
Thank you, with pleasure. You hear me well? So again, thank you. I apologize for not being able to join you in Dubai. I have a few comments. I will first focus on something which is, in my view, is extremely important in carbon pricing. When you see the effect of the rise of carbon pricing in the European Union, in the short run, the effect is not that important. I should say that the majority of the effect is in the increase of the price of energy. Why? Because it takes a lot of time for the substitution effect to play, for an increase in renewables and nuclear necessary to cope with the increasing demand of energy, or to substitute for CO2 emissions of energy. So it takes time. And what is extremely important in my view, and this is a raison d'etre of the task force on carbon pricing in Europe, is that the price of carbon in the long run is at a level which we consider as necessary for all the investors to adapt their investments in terms of energy transition to this level of carbon. And I give you an example, an historical example, which is extremely important. When we launched the European ETS in 2005, the price of carbon was more than 30 euro per ton. Then came the great financial crisis. And the price of carbon fell down it lost nearly 90% of its value. And it remained very low during a decade. And the price of carbon lost its efficiency in terms of target, in terms of for investments in the long run. And therefore, today, the price of carbon in the European ETS is around nearly less than 100 euro per ton. What is extremely important is that the people responsible in charge of the European ETS don't let the price of carbon go down. That's extremely important. Why? Because unfortunately, it's not impossible that there is a contraction of the economic activity in the European Union in the coming months, and then a decrease in the demand for energy, and therefore a very important impact on the European ETS. We saw it 2 years ago, you remember. And so the European Union, for the time being, is focused on the quantities and not on the price of carbon. And that is, in my view, something that has to be corrected. It's extremely important that the price of carbon of 100 euro per ton is predictable over time, so that all the investments in the hydrogen sector, in the necessity to reduce the emissions of carbon in many sectors, and so on, this price of carbon gives its full impact in terms of predictability. And this is a long-run problem, a very long-run problem, and we need a signal which is predictable in the long run. This is my message today. I have other ideas, but I will let the other participants to speak. But I really insist on that, and I will say that to the European Union. I already said that many times. I'm not sure that I've convinced everyone, but if we see the price of carbon go down in the future months, it will be a disaster. Because the markets, the people, all the people that invest in the long run will think that the 100 euro per ton is not very predictable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edmond, for also under your medical conditions joining us in. If there are no, up to now, we have no raised hands. If there are no raised hands now in the next minute, we can give the floor to Lord Adair Turner, the chair of the Energy Transition Commission and one of the most famous people in
Hello, can you hear me? There was a bit of an interruption there.
Yes.
Yes, I hear Tom House nodding. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I've only just managed to connect. I had a bit of an internet problem and sorry not to be there in Dubai. I would like to say a few words about the role of carbon pricing and the importance to think about its different appropriate role and its different relative importance in different sectors. Now, obviously, we are talking against the background of a situation where the price of fossil fuels is increasing very significantly across the world, both the cost of oil and in some parts of the world, the cost of gas. And of course, that reflects the energy crisis in the gas markets, which was occurring even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but has been made more severe since then. And it's true to say that at current gas and oil prices across the world, even without a carbon price, one would have a very strong incentive in many sectors of the economy to move away from carbon-intensive fuels. But we all know that it is a feature of our fossil fuel-based economy that we get huge oscillations in fossil fuel prices over time. And it may well be that in several years' time, we will see oil and gas and coal prices back down to levels which would slow the transition to a zero carbon economy unless there are carbon prices. The basic argument for a carbon price is very, very sound. But it's important to realize that the relative importance of it relative to other instruments varies by sector of the economy, and that the relative importance of international coordination or internationally agreed rules of the game varies by sector. There are some sectors of the economy where I think that carbon prices will play a role alongside other very important instruments of policy, and where there is no need for a common approach across the world. If, for instance, we look at the issues relating to the decarbonization of residential heating, starting in many countries where residential heating is important, with large use of gas. In the case of northern China, also some of the use of coal in district heating systems. We need to see a transition to zero carbon heating systems, whether it be a biogas, whether it be a hydrogen, or I think most likely some category of electrification. And in that move towards a zero carbon system of residential heating, it will make a difference if there is a carbon tax placed on gas or coal. But in that sector, we should not rely entirely on carbon prices, and we should realize the distributional consequences of carbon prices. When we are dealing with an area where decisions are made by millions of individual households, millions of individual households do not spend their evenings doing spreadsheets of the relative future cost of alternative ways of heating their house. They are not deeply rational mathematical decision makers. And what that means is that other instruments of policy, such as subsidy, such as regulation, such as making the market work in terms of the trained people and the trained companies that can do better home insulation and do new system insulation like heat pumps. Those are absolutely as important as the carbon price mechanism. And it is also true that it is in the residential heat area that we can have significant, potentially adverse distributional effects on low-income people if we rely simply on a carbon price mechanism. So in residential heat, yes, there is a role for carbon pricing, a general background of carbon pricing across the economy, but there are other instruments hugely important. There is a need for governments to pay attention to distributional effects, and there is no need for international coordination. It simply does not matter whether the carbon price that applies to the fuel used for residential heating is different in China than it is throughout Europe. And it does not matter if there is a different mix of policy instruments used, because there is no possibility of a competitive arbitrage of people getting round the carbon price or the regulations by going from one country to the other, by buying their residential heating in an international market. It is completely different in a small number of sectors of the economy which have two characteristics. One, they are energy intensive and they are organized by large, highly professional companies. If we are talking about cement or steel or chemicals plants or aviation or shipping, the use of energy is being determined, which form of energy is being determined by highly professional managers who are focusing on the fact that energy is a significant part of their cost base, and who therefore do respond very efficiently and rapidly to changes in relative prices. We have some sectors of the economy where relative prices are less effective because you do not have rational decision makers, and you have others where they are extremely effective. And those are the ones where energy is a large percentage of the input and where you have professional managers. So in steel, in cement, in chemicals, in shipping and aviation, we do already know what are the technologies that can take us to a zero carbon economy. We also know that while those will come down in price over time, there is likely for a very significant period and perhaps permanently to be a green cross premium. To make steel using hydrogen as the reduction agent rather than coking coal will probably for at least a couple of decades impose a higher cost of steel. It will be a higher cost route to make steel. So we have a high focus on energy cost. We have professional managers. We have a response to carbon pricing, and we need that carbon price to bridge the gap between the cost of the zero carbon solution and the high carbon solution. But the challenge, of course, is that those very sectors are also ones which are internationally traded. And therefore, we have just got to find some coordinated or globally agreed route in those specific sectors to deal with the cost of the problem of international competitiveness. If Europe goes ahead with a carbon price to create clear incentives for its steel industry to move to zero carbon steel, and if at the same time the major countries from which Europe might import steel, those have primarily recently been Turkey and Russia. Russia, I think, will be out for some time, but it could also include China and India. If Europe goes ahead, but those other countries do not go ahead with a carbon price, there is a serious competitive challenge. So what we do need to do in these sectors of the economy is all introduce carbon prices domestically, recognizing that they are hugely powerful levers in these heavy industry and long distance transport sectors. Ideally, in an ideal world, we would have roughly equivalent carbon prices and maybe even carbon trading between us. But if we do not have agreement on roughly equivalent carbon prices in these sectors, then we should accept that it is legitimate for an individual legal jurisdiction to impose a border carbon adjustment. All that is doing is making sure that the imports are subject to the same carbon price as the domestic production. So I hope that we will see a spread throughout the world of carbon pricing as a general tool, but it is, as I say, most important in some specific sectors of the economy which have particular characteristics and which also have an international coordination problem. In the area of aviation and shipping, the good news, of course, is that we do have international rule-making bodies, ICAO and IMO. These are bodies which are capable of imposing environmental regulation. We've seen that in the international maritime organizations, the IMO's enforcement on rules in relation, for instance, to high sulfur diesel. And it is absolutely possible, and I think would be a good way forward in those sectors of the economy to seek for international agreements on some development of carbon pricing, starting at a low level and gradually increasing over time. In other sectors of the economy, in steel or cement, we do not have international rule-making bodies which have the ability to set rules for those sectors. So it will have to be about the parallel, but I hope coordinated or at least mutually agreed approach to carbon pricing in those other sectors. Let me finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lord Turner. We are now moving to our session 2, coping with carbon pricing in a period of energy crisis. And here we will start with Jean-Pascal Clemenson, Senior Vice President, Strategy and Markets at Total Energies, the big French gas and oil firm. Jean-Pascal, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon to all of you. Just wanted to check, first of all, that you can hear me and you can see me. Right, very good. Thank you again for giving me the chance to share with you Total Energies' viewpoints on the compatibility of carbon pricing with the necessity to satisfy the demand for energy. The key agenda of Total Energies' strategy is to ensure the security and affordability of energy to meet the growing demands of the world's population in the most sustainable way possible. This population is expected to grow to close to 10 billion people by 2050, and providing access to energy to all these people will be a huge challenge. Already today, a staggering 800 million people do not have access to electricity. Emerging countries have also rapidly growing middle-class population. And in aggregate, the global middle-class population is expected to reach 5.3 billion people by 2030. Close to 90% of the additional middle-class population will be in Asia, where growth will be the strongest. Climate issues cannot be ignored, but these people have not only a legitimate and fundamental right to energy access, but also to economic development to improve their standard of living. We must acknowledge that the pace of the energy transition is to be handled with care. In 2021, oil and gas prices have risen sharply due to a combination of rising demand from a huge economic recovery, manufacturers restocking their inventories, and a supply-side squeeze driven by a cold snap in Texas that affected oil and gas exports, and China's decision to stop importing coal from Australia. This led to China importing more gas, in turn driving up prices in Europe. The longer-term concern is a lack of investment in the energy sector. In 2014, investment in the oil and gas industry topped the $700 billion. Last year, it was just $350 billion. Globally, we still rely on fossil fuel for 80% of our power, but a lack of investment will see a natural decline of 3 to 4% in oil well productivity. Meanwhile, investment in renewable is not increasing sufficiently fast enough to fill the gap. If energy security was already the key priority of emerging countries' energy policies, it has become also a major concern in Europe, all the more so with the Ukrainian crisis. In May 2021, Total became Total Energy, with a clear commitment to transform itself into a multi-energy company within the decade, and the ambition to get to net zero by 2050 together with society by providing our customer a new mix of low carbon energy. Total Energies must now heavily invest in not 2, but 7 energies, including electricity, hydrogen, biomass, wind, and solar, with the aim of being among the top 5 renewable energy providers worldwide by 2030. To fund the energy transition, Total Energies' capital investment strategy is therefore designed to accompany the growth of our overall energy production by 30% in 2030. Concretely, we will allocate 50% of our investments to maintain our current production. The other 50% will be allocated to growth. Half of our growth investment will be dedicated to natural gas, mainly LNG, and the other half to the development of new energies. We will not divest from fossil fuel. Cash generated from today's energy will be used to invest in the energy of the future. We are targeting oil and gas investments that generate strong cash flow and are resistant to price fluctuation with a low greenhouse gas emission, below 20 kilos of CO2 per barrel. The way we ensure that is by applying to all of these investments a carbon price, wherever their geographical location. In order to get the go-ahead, this investment needs to pass our economic hurdle with a price of $100 per ton of CO2 by 2030, or existing price if above, like in Norway, for instance. Why this level? CO2 storage in depleted oil and gas fields may be profitable with a carbon price of $100 per ton. At that price, Total Energies can offer to take and store the CO2 emitted by manufacturers such as steelmakers and cement makers. This approach has been very effective to instill within our employees a strong CO2 culture, driving strong improvements on emission reduction of our operation, the scope 1 and 2. And for instance, in 2021, we achieved a reduction of minus 20% of this emission versus 2015, which is a major step towards our 2030 objective of reaching minus 40%. This was the illustration of the use of carbon price by an energy company with a global footprint that I wanted to share with you today. And thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much. I think it was a very good. We just moved a bit so that you see there is in this house is also a palm tree. You can see it behind me. And the floor is now to our second speaker on this panel, Tryggvi Thor Herbertsson, Chairman of Queer Iceland. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Franz. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, Edmund, for organizing this important seminar and to the speakers for their excellent contributions. In this short intervention, I would like to emphasize that we need the price of carbon to increase going forward in order to create incentives to advance new renewable energy technologies. It is apparent that uncertainty has increased tremendously last few weeks with the Russian invasion into Ukraine. The Germans seem to have changed some of their policies substantially, and I'm sure more will follow, especially in terms of energy. For example, it is hard to see now the Nord Stream 2 project proceeding after the crisis, and that will pose increased pressure on the European energy market. Energy prices will remain high and even get higher. And to counter these increasing prices, the pressure on developing alternative energy modes will increase. The higher the price of carbon, the faster Europe and the world will develop and shift to non-carbon energy sources. Hydrogen will be the most important source of energy in the upcoming energy transition. In order to level the playing ground for hydrogen with currently used energy vectors, carbon prices will need to be increased. This is exactly what we've been seeing lately. CO2 prices per tonnage are reaching almost 100 euros per ton, although there have been some setbacks the last few days. However, carbon prices must be increased on industries in a symmetric way. Levying a uniform tax will not create the necessary incentive to shift in an efficient way. And this will create a challenge for the design of the system. The demand curve differs between industries, and thus increases in price of inputs had different consequences for different industries. Furthermore, we need CBAM to be enforced, otherwise there will be carbon leakages. Industries will simply move to countries that do not enforce. My company, CARE, is now developing hydrogen projects in countries such as Brazil, Iceland, France, and other countries. And our goal is to have around 30 gigawatts of hydrogen produced annually by 2030. And this will create huge challenges, and carbon pricing will play a very big role there. However, the challenge of the industry, aside from carbon pricing, is how do we transport pure hydrogen over long distances in an efficient way. And that is, I think that is the second most pressing problem that we are facing now, or the second most facing challenge that we're facing now, and which governments and private companies should be focusing on. Anyway, thank you and have a good day.
So thank you very much. One message also. Hydrogen is also seen as a fuel of the future also in this region. For example, in the last debate, we had a discussion with representatives from Oman. And Oman is developing hydrogen as a future fuel because they have a lot of land, they have a lot of sun, and in addition, they have a lot of wind. So we see hydrogen as one possible export after oil and gas is not exportable anymore. So also in this region here, hydrogen is seen as a fuel of the future.
Exactly, but the challenge there is the transportation of the produce.
Yeah.
But you're exactly right.
Yeah. Here we have one thing. Some Austrian companies we wanted to produce hydrogen in Ukraine because more sun, more wind, and more space than in Austria, and use existing gas pipelines for exporting hydrogen, and you need relatively few adaptations to this gas pipelines also for hydrogen export. So here we can use existing gas infrastructure for hydrogen also. But now we are, I think we can have a discussion.
Please raise your hand if you would like to intervene.
Please raise your hands if you want to intervene. Because,
I'm ready to intervene. I would prefer not to speak to be the first speaker, but I'm ready to speak, Franz.
Please, the speakers should comment. Edmond. Edmond,
No one wants to speak? Okay. Okay, thank you very much. This is a follow-up of what others said, which was absolutely excellent. And also the two former speakers, one on oil and gas, and the other on renewables. And I chose these two speakers, these two topics, because they are extremely, extremely relevant, actually, when we see what is going on during this energy crisis. The problem we are facing with carbon pricing is the kind of trade-off between two impacts of carbon pricing. The first is the substitution due to the elasticity of the demand for CO2 fuel, CO2 emissions fuel. Between this impact and substitution from CO2 emission fuel to renewables or nuclear, at least CO2-free emissions of energy, and the distribution effect of the increase of carbon. Or if you prefer, it's a trade-off between the short run and the long run. And that you understand that it's a follow-up as well of my first comment. When you see what's going on, actually, is very telling, and we economists have to look at these issues much, much more carefully than we are doing, because it is at the heart of the solution, if there is one, on the fight against climate change. The problem we are facing today, and I take as an example what's going on in the European Union, is that we have increased over the last 12 months the price of carbon. It has, I don't know exactly, but it has increased by more than 3 times. More than 3 times. The price of carbon before the COVID-19 crisis in the European Union was less than 20 euro per ton. And it is now nearly 100 euro per ton in a very short span time. That's unbelievable, the increase in the price of carbon. The problem is that when you increase the price of carbon, why do you do that? It's not for the pleasure. Just because you hope that there will be a strong incentive for a shift of production of energy from fossil fuel to carbon-free source of energy, renewables in the first place, but also nuclear. And it takes a lot of time to have this shift, a lot of time. And so when you increase the price of carbon in a short period of time, the effect is in the increase of the price of energy. Not only the price of fossil fuel energy, but all the prices of energy, even coal. And you can see today that never the coal has been used more than today to produce energy, despite the increase in the price of carbon, and despite all our endeavors. So we have to think about that. And obviously, when you increase the price of carbon, obviously, this has an impact at this level. This has an impact on the purchasing power, even though it is not so important. And it has an impact on the perception of the public opinion about the use of this tool to fight carbon pricing. So we have to be very careful to look at this issue in all its dimensions. And so I come now to the problem of the substitution effect. What is important and what is, in my view, neglected today is to look at the impact in terms of elasticity of the demand for CO2-free energy of the price of carbon according to the different policies we are doing. And this comes to the observation of other. When you increase, and to what we experience in France with the yellow vests, when you increase, and to what you are doing, France, in Austria, and many countries, when you increase the price of carbon in buildings and transportation, housing, transportation, the immediate impact is on the purchasing power. This explains the policy of Austria or even France or other countries. But what is the effect on the substitution effect in terms of increase in the demand in renewables or nuclear and decrease in the use of fossil fuel energy? Very little, very little. The trade-off is very bad when you compare the social impact and the economic impact, which we are calling for. That is extremely important, and just keep that in mind, because we will fail if we don't understand that. And the economists in this respect have to look at this issue much more carefully than they do today. But there are sectors, business sectors, where we can get major results if we deal with the price of carbon in these sectors individually. I give you two examples, and I will come to European CBAM, which is probably the best lever we have to fight global warming. Actually, China is in a very complicated situation, and we should not underestimate it, because the demand for energy is increasing. There are a lot of people that the public authorities have to increase their purchasing power, and so it's very complicated for them to close down and they will not, the major emission of carbon in the world. The major emission of carbon in the world is the coal-fired plants in China. 4.5 billion tons of carbon each year, more than 12% of carbon emissions in the world. How to cope with this issue? How to cope with it? Close the plants? Don't think about it. They won't never do it, and they are right not to do it, because it's young, they are young, and they need the electricity. So they have to retrofit these plants. They have to retrofit them by CCS, carbon and capture, capture and storage, and that needs a lot of money, Retrofitting CCS in China or around the world in order to stop the emissions of carbon is a lot of money. But they have created a national carbon market, and then could use the proceeds of this national carbon market for carbon, even at a level of price of carbon which is not so low, much lower than the price actually in Europe of 100 euro per ton. And with the proceeds of this price of carbon, they could fund the retrofitting of these firms. So you see that there are solutions. The same in steel industry. In steel industry, which is one of the major sectors for emitting carbons in the world, we should put in place, through a price of carbon applied to the sector, in coordination with this sector, we could accelerate the necessary and avoidable investments to reduce or even to get rid of this emission of carbon. Obviously, the same for methane. There has been an agreement on methane, but methane is a disaster actually in the world. The impact on climate change is unbelievable. And we could put in place some global price of carbon with the support of the oil and gas industry. And so we have solution to immediately stop the increase of emissions of carbon through the business sectors that are the most emitting of carbon. And so we have solution, but this rests on a very clear analysis of economic analysis of the elasticities and the impacts of the price of carbon in each sector. And it will also rest on the fact that the European Union has launched a very powerful tool, which I hope will be put in place in 2026, which is the European CBAM, which can be a lever for the sectors concerned to make necessary endeavors. They will have to do it. It is not imaginable to consider that the steel industry or the coal power plants or the oil and gas industry in terms of methane will go on emitting what they are emitting today. They know it. They need investments, and we have to create as soon as possible the incentives for these sectors with a level playing field globally to make this investment. It's a question of life on earth. It's not complicated, and the economists have a big responsibility to explain that to all the people, all the citizens of the world. It's a question of life for our children and grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Edmond, for this good explanation. Vitor, you wanted to make a comment?
Yes, please, France, if I may. Edmond, thank you very much for your passion.
Thank you very much for the early time you're joining us, because in Washington it's really early.
Thanks, Frank. Edmond, thank you very much for your very insightful and passionate intervention. There is one small issue that I want to discuss with you, which is the issue of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Ideally, I believe you agree, but I want to have your reassurance. The best would be to have a global agreement on a international carbon price floor, and if that is the case, a carbon border adjustment could become redundant in the context of that global agreement. And we have at the IMF been pushing for an agreement involving the largest emitters, China, India, the United States, and the European Union, precisely to push for such an agreement. Would you be in favor of that, Edmond, or do you have further considerations to add?
So, Edmond.
I am fully in agreement with that. I think that in order to succeed the decarbonization process, we need leadership. We need a global leadership. One country alone won't make the trick. We need a global leadership of at least the three main emitters, and India will come very, very soon. The increase in emissions of India is appalling. So we need a leadership of the three main economic emitters, which are the US, China, and the European Union. That is absolutely key. Now, I come back to your idea, which is the price of carbon globally. You have launched, Victor, the IMF has launched, thanks to your leadership, an excellent idea, which I absolutely share, which is price of carbon, if possible, for all the countries of the world, if possible. Maybe it's complicated, but at least ideally, that would be probably a very good idea, at least a very good objective. The problem with that is the following. We have a major issue, which we all know, is that when you look at the stock of carbon in the atmosphere, the majority of it comes from industrialized countries for historical reasons. And so we have a debt towards the emerging countries for two reasons. First, because they are not responsible of the majority of the stock. And the second is that the demand for energy in the future will come from them. And it would be unfair, unjust, and politically stupid to think that we will force them to reduce their demand for energy, because then that will not allow them to go to the same level of economic growth needed for getting out of poverty. So we have this problem. We have this problem to cope with the demand for energy from the emerging countries. And the fact that the industrial countries have to, in a way or another, help them to respond to this demand for energy through clean energy, CO2 free emissions energy. And this is a huge issue, which will need a lot of resources. And I think that your idea of a price of carbon, which does not need to be high, because if you have a price of carbon of about 10 or 20 euro per ton, it's bearable for everyone in the world, even people that are not very rich, all around the world, distributed to the emerging countries to help them to build their clean energy sector, renewables or nuclear, because I think there is no solution. You can think whatever you think about nuclear, and what happens in Ukraine is obviously something which is very worrying. But anyhow, I don't think that there is any solution to the energy transition without nuclear. I looked at the issue through its own all the dimensions. But anyhow, we need to help these countries to respond to their huge demand for energy in the future by funding which can come, in my view, only by a price of carbon globally. And that is the idea of the IMF, or I should say with a personal amendment. Now, I come to another issue, which is the fact that this is not enough to start really decarbonizing the planet. The problem we have today is when you look at the evolution of the emission of carbon, it is still increasing. It is still increasing at a very high speed. And you have the stock of carbon which is increasing every year. It will increase. It has increased last year. It will increase this year, and so on and so on. And if you want to stop this move, which is putting in jeopardy life on Earth, you need to change the trend, to have a trend which goes downwards, and the sooner the better. And then I come to the sectoral approach, because and the problem of the elasticity. Apart from your proposal of a global price of carbon, which should go to funding the emerging countries, I think that we should put in place sectoral prices of carbon in the steel industry, in the electricity sector for the coal-fired plants, in the cement industry, in petrochemical, in methanes, and so on, with the support and the agreement of the firms all around the world, as we did to save the ozone layer with the Montreal Protocol, as we did again with the Kigali Amendment for refrigerants, but with an incentive which doesn't exist in these agreements, which is a sectoral price of carbon. And if we put that in place and use CBAM to do that, because CBAM is just is the best lever to go in this direction, I think that we could change really the situation in terms of emissions of carbon in the world. This is my point, Victor. I do think that, and it's not that complicated, because I know that I have been not only in politics but also in the business in business during part of my life. I know that all these people are very responsible in the oil and gas industry and in steel and so on, and they are perfectly aware that they have to make the investment to stop their carbon emissions, but it costs a lot of money. And if we put an incentive, and if we create this incentive through a price of carbon, that can be used, by the way, for them to make these investments, then obviously they will do it. They just need a level playing field at the global level. And so I think that we have to think together with the IMF. The IMF is so important in this respect. The energy, international energy as well, the OECD as well, all these institutions have to think to such a framework, which in my view deals in a very concrete way with the emissions of carbon, going to the source of the emissions, which are the business. We are emitting carbon when we are using our cars or in our buildings, okay, but will we change our cars if we increase the price of carbon? I doubt it. It's a question of business in the first place. So this is my answer, Victor. And my pledge is that there is no time to lose. I'm afraid of that. The last reports, you saw them, are a catastrophe. So there is no time to lose. I know that there is a crisis of energy. I listened very carefully to the very responsible message of Monsieur Clémençon for Total Energy, which I share, by the way. We have to be very careful about the negative impact of what we are doing on the supply of energy. But this will be my message today. No time to spare. Let us go to the concrete decisions to take to reverse the trend of the decarbonization of the planet. Thank you.
Okay, now we have somebody who wants the floor, Mr. Kaolin. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Follow the opinion of Mr. Edmond. I would like to share some news information of CCS in China. Just as mentioned by Mr. Edmond, we have a lot of the coal-fired power plants, and the most important thing is power plants are young. Most of them had been built in last 10 to 20 years, and it will still working at least 20 to 30 years.
Yeah.
Yes, that will be the how to say the most concrete emission sources in the last 20 to 30 years in China. And we are working on the large scale demonstration. 3 projects taken by the power plants and oil field. And I believe that we can make it in 2 to 3 years. But the most key problem is that if we cannot get enough support from the market, either from the carbon market or from the energy market, even we have finished the demonstration, we could not deploy it in large scale in the last 10 to 20 years. And we will lose all these opportunities to capture CO2 from these coal-fired power plants. That's the key problem. I believe that we can make 2 to 3 large-scale demonstration projects in the last 3 years. It's okay, but it could not last long because the enterprise could not afford the cost, not only from the capture, but also from the storage, from the geological storage. That is the key point. So I totally agree with Mr. Edmond. The price of carbon is not need to be so high, but it had to be connected with the enterprise doing the CCS. We must have this connection and have this support from the market. And the market, I believe, will do the rest things. And the first is that we have to get some support from this economic field. That's my comments. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I also fully agree. It's very easy to shut down a coal power plant 30 or 40 years old, and which is already depreciated. And it's a whole different thing to shut down a new coal power plant, which is much more difficult to do. So CCS or other storage, not only technology, but also planting trees, using jungle and other stuff to store carbon efficiently or at lower cost. We should explore all these avenues also. But Vitor, you want to make also a comment?
Say again, Franz. I missed what you said.
I said it's very difficult it's very difficult to close down a new coal power plant. It's relatively easy to close down a coal power plant which is 30 or 40 years old and depreciated.
Fully agree. Fully agree.
For Europe, it's much easier than it is for China, and we should take account of this. And for China, you probably need some CCS technology for this new coal power plants. And not only CCS, but also storage of carbon, for example, by planting trees or in tropical jungles. Everything should be explored. Vitor, the floor is now yours.
You want me to conclude, Franz?
If we first, if we have no other questions, we could conclude. We have no raised hands.
Okay.
Probably you will want to say something.
Absolutely, I do, Franz. So, Franz, it's such a pleasure to join you in the Austrian pavilion of the Dubai Expo. I would prefer to meet you in person But this time around, it was not possible. I believe that we would have had an even better meeting if we had a chance to meet in person, and I certainly hope that we'll be able to do that before long. For me, it has been a pleasure to be associated with Edmond Alfandery and the work of the task force on carbon pricing in Europe. And we could all hear the leadership and the passion of Edmond when he made statements as strong as we have solutions. We as economists have to work on the relevant trade-offs and fill in the details, and there is no time to waste. There is no time to waste when it comes to the fight against climate change. We had right at the beginning of our work session today a very inspiring overview by Laurent Fabius, and I will, in a sense, revisit the themes that Laurent introduced right at the beginning. But I will reorganize the topics slightly in order to adapt to what we have learned during the day today. We should probably start with the issue of ambition. And the gap in ambition is concentrated in the near term. Edmond has reminded us that CO2 emissions have increased in 2021, and they are projected to continue to increase in 2022. While in the context of the climate agreements and the national determined contributions, 140 countries have made net zero pledges for the mid-century. The current pledges fall well short of what is needed by 2030. That basically means that the closest that we come to today, the more we are lacking in ambition, and we need to have effective action right now. To repeat, Edmond, we have no time to waste. Laurent Fabius reminded us that in the context of the process leading to the COP27 in Egypt, countries will have to submit revised national determined contributions, and in that context, an increase in ambition, in immediate ambition, is most needed. Laurent Fabius also made a very strong plea for global collective action. Gases emissions leading to climate change are a global externality, and it's very important that the world tackles that global challenge in a cooperative way. There are many ideas of how to do so. The proposal of the International Monetary Fund of an international carbon price floor led by the largest emitters was generally quoted by many participants in our exchange. The possibility of having different price floors in accordance with countries' characteristics was something that Laurent Fabius argued was completely in line with common but differentiated responsibilities. And Edmond has reminded us of the historical responsibilities of the now advanced economies in the process of accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. For all of these reasons, international cooperation is a must. And one other area where the global community has been lacking is in the delivery of the financial support pledges to developing countries, and the famous commitment to 100 billion financing per year is now pushed back to 2023. Now, issues are complicated because carbon pricing, crucial as it is not sufficient. Regulations play a role, and in particular, during the course of our various sessions, the importance of sectoral policies was much emphasized, with specific examples having to do with important sectors. The steel production was used several times as a example, and the same was true for more traditional sectors like coal, gas, and oil. Something which is crucial is the issue of justice and distribution. It is my last point. It was Laurent Fabius's first point. Many, perhaps all, of the speakers today refer to the importance of geopolitical disturbances, and specifically Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, triggering quite a substantial turbulence in energy markets and a sharp increase in energy prices. In that context, it is necessary to protect vulnerable households and firms, but at the same time, keep the climate ambitions intact and keep the instruments that serve climate policies on target to deliver on our climate change goals. Edmond referred to this as a trade-off between the short run and the long run. I would here emphasize the importance of tackling distribution concerns with distribution instruments, and try to use that to preserve our commitment to the long run. My last point is likely to take a couple of minutes and goes back to 2015, when a new global agenda was put in place, characterized by the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, approved in September, and the Climate Paris Agreement, the COP21, that was led by Laurent Fabius in December. These two agendas are very, very closely interlinked, and they remind us that the poorest are hit hardest by climate change, and they're also hit hardest by energy costs and their volatility. The role of carbon pricing in this context has to do with the fact that it increases the financial capacity of states, and that allows us to collectively support the poorest and most vulnerable countries, the poorest and most vulnerable in our societies. And we learned today that in Austria, an ambitious scheme of carbon pricing was put together, but it was put together at the same time that a portion of the revenues generated was given back to Austrian families in accordance with the national and regional scheme. The importance of taking into account the allocation effects of carbon pricing, but also the uses of the financial resources that it generates is a very important dimension to produce the solutions that Edmond so passionately calls for. And friends, if you allow me, I stop here and I go back to you.
Vitor, thank you very much. Now I would like Edmond, if he wants to say something. Edmond,
yes, just very briefly on France, just to thank all of you for this excellent panel, this event which you chaired beautifully, France. And I thank you very much for that. I'm sorry for not being with us, but you replaced me very well, and probably you did better than I would have done. So thank you very much, France. Thank you to all the speakers. I'm very proud to have, with the other people, members of the task force and France in the first place, to have assembled so many people which are devoted to this issue and which are absolutely fantastic. Laurent Fabius, but also Dominique Bureau. Thank you, Dominique. Tom Oss, excellent presentation. Lord Turner, as ever. Thank you, Adair. That was a very, very thoughtful presentation. Your minister, Leonard Gaffler, who was very convincing, and it was important to have some policymaker explaining the way policy has to deal with these issues. Jean-Pascal Clémençon, very useful to explain the responsibilities of a major industries in oil and gas. And Trygve Tord Ebertson, which reminded us the problem of renewables, which is at the heart of the issue. And not least, obviously, Victor. Victor, you are playing a major role, actually. And I will not thank you enough for what the IMF is doing to promote the idea of a global price of carbon, which in my view is absolutely key for the future and for decarbonization. And so I think we opened the discussion to very, very important issues. And I think one of them is this problem of the trade-off between the short run and the long run, which appears clearly to all of us through this energy crisis. Now, let me end up. I started by just a short message, which was read for me by France about Ukraine. And I will end up by saying that all our thoughts go to the Ukrainian people. This aggression they are suffering in their lives, and where the future of their country is at stake, is not only a drama for Ukraine, it's a drama for the world at large. It is a barbaric attack which with all the people of the world, the task force on carbon pricing, which is obviously devoted to the shift, the fight against global warming, is strongly condemning, and we are behind and we support the Ukrainian people. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for this excellent event, which is very important, at least for the work of the task force.
Yes, thank you very much, Edmond. I think we can conclude now, but I would end at an optimistic tone, because when I arrived here in Dubai, I did not expect that Dubai was so interested and strong in lowering their carbon emissions. And they have a very ambitious goal. And I was told that they have also sufficient funds put in place to fulfill these goals. So we should work hard, but also be and remain optimistic. So thank you very much, everybody, and Edmond, all the best for your health.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much to everyone for joining us on Sunday morning, early morning for some of you, and for our Chinese friends in the evening. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Monsieur Alfonderi? Ah, he disconnected. Okay.
It disconnected already.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Good.
So we stop.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Franz.
Thank you.